Hey guys, it's Cece, and today I'm here to talk about the books that I read in the month of January. So in case you were unaware, January was a special kind of reading month in that I went and bought a TBR specifically to read in January. If you want to check out my TBR, I highly recommend it. It's a little long, but it's in a vlog style where Brian, my roommate, made up a bunch of challenges. We went to Barnes & Noble and we filmed me trying to find books that fit those particular challenges. I bought them, and I was supposed to be reading them in January. I wound up picking 6 books while I was doing that challenge. There are 2 of them that I did not complete in January. I didn't get to either of these 2, Truly Madly Guilty or Tell Me How You Really Feel, but, I did read 7 total books in January, so I think I'm okay that I missed these 2. We had some winners, and we had some very, very big losers as far as what I read in January. And we are going to start with what I rated lowest and work my way up to the highest rated book. I think a lot of people already know what my lowest rated is gonna be, but it's fine. You guys finally get to hear me tear these books apart, so I hope you're ready for that. And yeah, let's just go ahead and get started with the book or books that I liked least. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is a series, Bronze Gods and Silver Mirrors by A.A. Aguirre. This is actually a series by a married couple that are just writing under a single pen name. Oh, these books. So let's start with a summary. Bronze Gods is about these 2 detectives, Mikani and Ritsuko, and they are just your general detectives in this steampunk fantasy world. They get called to solve a murder, and it turns out to be a lot more intense a crime than they originally thought. So when I originally did my TBR challenge, I just picked up Silver Mirrors, and then, afterwards I found out it was a series, but I assumed because it was a detective story, I might still just be able to jump into this without this book. That was not the case. I did a bunch of reading of reviews beforehand and discovered I was going to have to read Bronze God, so I bought it on Amazon, and read this, and with each page of reading this, dreaded more and more the fact that I owned the second book and said I would read it. There are so many things. There are so many things I want to talk about with these, and I know I'm not going to have the time to do it. So, the biggest issue with book 1, which is Bronze Gods, is that the timeline never makes any sense. It's never clarified, and there's not a single page on which timeline makes sense. So they're supposed to be solving this murder, and by day 2, you're already getting into the cliched captain calling him down and being like, the higher-ups are yelling at me, why don't you have this solved yet? But in theory, it's been a day since they started working on the mystery and the consequences, despite however long this mystery goes on. I couldn't tell you. I think they claim it's 2 weeks, but it feels like months. The consequences never get more dire than that. They're constantly threatened that they're going to get taken off the case, but on the one occasion that they do get taken off the case, they're put back on in half an hour. The other thing is interrupting thoughts, and that was a problem that both of these books had so badly. So we go back and forth between third-person limited narration, Ritsuko or Mikani narrating, and then in the second book we get an additional voice who's narrating, and then in the first book there's a side plot that becomes relevant later on, and there's a different person narrating that section. So, but mostly Mikani and Ritsuko. But despite the fact that it's third-person limited, so you're already inside that person's head, there will be narration that explains what's going on in the person's head, and then it'll switch to italics, and you'll hear the exact same thing, but from first person. They're having that thought. I don't know if I'm making sense. It was really frustrating, but it got so repetitive. One example of repetitive narration, this is the first time I dog-eared a page to be what is happening? Let's see. Mikani wished Ritsuko was here, as she was better at dealing with these situations. Unfortunately, he had to handle this one. You don't need 2 sentences for that. I promise. If someone's crying and you say that you wish Ritsuko was there, you don't then have to clarify that she's not there. Because you already did that. There's another really good repetitive line in Silver Mirrors. Where was it? Oh, yeah. Okay. She stopped dead when she saw him, the thoughtful expression turning wary at his expression. What's happening? The other big thing with Bronze Gods that was more apparent in the first one than the second one is that no big climactic moment was given any attention, so the entire thing just felt one note. Like, you would reach a point where you assumed the plot would be reaching some kind of peak, but no matter how big that moment was, it would take max a page and a half. Like, someone could have tried burning down a building and they'd have it worked out in a page and a half and would just, like, not mention it again. The second book did a better job with that. Like, the big action sequences felt more like action sequences in the second book. It was given time. The biggest problem with the second book is that, well, this is a steampunk fantasy. This completely loses any element of steampunk. It's just a fantasy adventure quest. There is no longer any kind of steampunk influence. You could just as easily be writing this as part of a fantasy trilogy. It's about a pirate ship. They're constantly boarded by pirates. It's just a fantasy book, as opposed to this, which does still have steampunk elements. There are also 2 books to solve the same mystery. So you get to the end of this, and they've solved part of the mystery, but it takes an entire second book of absolutely nothing having any meaning to the central plot, and then at the end they're like, okay, now I think we finished solving this mystery. Why do I have these other places marked? What could have happened? Oh, yes, I like this one a lot. Well done, Miss Braylon said to Evans, who was coughing. I wanted to take a red pen to these books so badly. I'm not even getting into, like, the weird misogyny elements of this book that, like, if you're gonna make a fantasy, you don't have to include misogyny in your fantasy, but Ritsuko is the only female detective in the entire CID. And so the way that they explain this is not to be like, oh, we should let more women be detectives. Instead, it's constantly this emphasis that she's different than other women, and that's why she made it into the CID. The number of times Makani carries her out of a situation in both of these books is more than once, which is too many times, but it's more, I think it's like 4 or 5 times that Makani picks Ritsuko up because she's just too weak to handle the situation and carries her out. I think they were going for like a Mulder-Scully romance thing with these characters, but it never made any sense because their characterizations would change on a dime from page to page. They'd be totally different people. I think the biggest one that I wrote about on Twitter was that in this book, Ritsuko and Makani come across this dead body that has had its throat cut, and Ritsuko, a seasoned detective, like, has a moment where she's horrified that anyone could murder someone, and you're like, aren't you a murder detective? And then by the time you get to this book, she's just, like, shooting people in the face every other page. I've scratched the surface of my complaints about these books. They were messy, poorly edited, the action sequences were nothing, it took way too long to get anywhere, every single person that they interviewed acted the exact same way, no matter who they were interviewing. These were a disaster, and I gave them each 1 star. I hated reading these. So yeah. There you go. I feel a little bit better now that I've ranted. I still haven't gotten out all my feelings, though. Yeah, I'm just throwing them now. The amount Brian has heard me complain about these over the past month is a lot. Okay, let's move on to The Good Girl by Mary Kubica. So, The Good Girl, this is about a girl. She's good, I assume. Her name's Mia. Basically, she's been kidnapped, and the book, we only get perspectives from the kidnapper, and the detective solving her case. No, sorry, every now and then we also get a point of view from her mother. So basically, this guy, he was hired to kidnap a girl named Mia and deliver her to a person, and instead he decides to not deliver her, and he just takes her to a secluded cabin. So we're getting, like, before perspectives from the detective who is trying to solve the kidnapping, and we're also getting after perspectives from after she's been found, and we're working towards, like, a middle location where we finally understand what has gone on. This book had a lot of really good aspects. I would say in the first 2/3, it was well-paced, it was interesting. I didn't really love that the plot of this book was kind of just Mia falling for her kidnapper. Like, that's very much what's implied throughout and what you get right away, but then you get more context. Didn't really like that aspect of the book at all. But my biggest issue with this book is that I read the first, I want to say 50 or so pages, and I went, you know what would be the worst twist ending for this book? And I had guessed what the actual ending of this book was. Like, the twist was so laughable and ridiculous that it completely obliterated the enjoyment that I'd had for the rest of the book. I mean, like, this is fast-paced, it's gonna keep you engaged, it's interestingly written as far as a mystery goes, you're always trying to kind of figure out what's gone on, but it's all building to this point that is completely ridiculous and that I was so deeply annoyed by. And that's my problem with thrillers over and over again. I have this problem where they're well written, they're interesting, and then the twist is so bad, there's just no point to the rest of the book. I can't rate a thriller without considering how it ends, because that's always the point that you're building to with the thriller. And if you build and build and build, and at the very end you completely let a reader down, or something comes out of left field, or it's cliche, I don't see a point in the rest of the book. So, yeah, I think before the ending I would have given this like a 3, maybe a 3.5 star, but I wound up giving it a 2 because that ending was shit. And completely destroyed the rest of the book for me. Next up, we have Our Own Private Universe by Robin Talley. So this is a female-female romance. It's about a 15-year-old girl named Aki, and she knows that she's bi, but she hasn't come out to anybody, and then she goes on a church mission to Mexico, and she meets a girl named Krista, and the two of them start to fall for each other. The thing that this book was most highly praised for at the time that it was released, which I think was a couple years ago, I feel like 2017. 2017. The thing it was most highly praised for was its discussion of safe sex between girls. I think it's rare enough to find a YA book that's going to discuss any kind of safe sex, but particularly going into the very specific details of how safe sex between girls works was like a big selling point at this book. And I do think that that is one of the places where it succeeded. It was incredibly educational, it was incredibly normalizing, while also talking about how that type of education doesn't currently exist very freely for girls. So I liked that aspect, and also I liked the realism of the voice for all of these characters who are around 15 and 16. They're very dramatic. They don't really, like, a lot of times things could be solved by people just not lying, but it's because they're 15, and I felt like that voice was a very authentic voice for a group of 15-year-old characters. My problems with this book were kind of exactly what I thought my problems with this book were going to be. So I read a book by Robin Talley, I think it may have been her debut, called Lies We Tell Ourselves, which got in some trouble because Robin Talley is a white author, and in that book, she wrote a black perspective, but particularly a perspective in the 60s, and so it was really ridden with racism, and it used the N-word a lot, and people were uncomfortable with a white author writing from a black perspective in the 1960s. This book also follows a black main character, and I would just like to request that Robin Talley stop that, because it was obvious. It was obvious that this was a book written by a white author trying to write a black perspective. One of the big plot points of this book is that there's going to be this church meeting where their entire church decides what issues they are going to condemn and what issues they're going to support. And so a lot of the teen characters in the book try to take particular stances on these topics. And the topic of police brutality is brought up. There are maybe 4 black characters, black kids especially, who are in this church group, and that's mentioned specifically at the beginning, that Aki notes she is one of the only black kids on this trip, but then when police brutality is brought up, she offers no opinion. She's like, oh yeah, that might be an interesting thing to discuss. It's just stuff like that would be brought up more and just isn't. So it feels very obvious that it was written by a white author. Also, I don't know that I really want to get into this fully, but there is the implication of sort of the savior narrative that's happening with this church going down to a small city in Mexico and trying to solve all of their problems. I don't know how much that was commented on. I think it could have been dealt with better. There are issues. So I liked the female-female romance in that aspect, but there were too many other elements that felt very obviously from a white perspective that were not dealing with issues as well as I think they should have been dealt with. So I wound up giving this book like a 3-star, an easy 3. It could have gone lower. Just wish Robin Talley would stop sometimes, you know? Because she writes books and they sound interesting, but they're also sound bad. I think I'm done reading Robin Talley for a bit, which is what I said a little while ago as far as Lies We Tell Ourselves, but I picked this up to give her another shot, and she did not earn an additional shot after this. Next, I want to talk about the book that my patrons picked for me to read, and that is Running with Lions by Julian Winters. In case you don't know, I have a Patreon, and every month patrons vote and choose a book that I'm going to be reading in the following month, and they picked for me to read Running with Lions in January. They've also already picked my February book, but if you want to be a part of my Patreon group, maybe help me pick videos that I'm going to be making or books that I'll be reading, the link will be in the description below. Running with Lions by Julian Winters. This copy was actually also sent to me by a subscriber from Ash. It is about a summer soccer camp. The main character, Sebastian Hughes, he's headed into his senior year of high school and he's feeling really lost as far as what he's going to do with his future, but people feel pretty sure that he is going to be made team captain of the Lions, which is the soccer team that he plays for at his school. He's also a really big fan of this group of boys because it's been pushed in this group that no one is going to be judged for who they are. Their coach is very serious about everyone being accepted and open about their sexuality, about anything else that they want to share, and there are pretty severe consequences if you aren't accepting. So Sebastian feels like this is his one place where he can be safe, openly identifying as bi. And then, when he goes to the soccer camp, his estranged childhood best friend, Amir, is there, and there is some bad feeling going on between the two boys, but it is up to Sebastian to make Amir feel welcome and to feel like he is part of the team, and to maybe mend the relationship that they used to have. This book is sweet. I think that it does a good job dealing with intimacy between boys beyond just, like, relationships between boys. I just really liked this brand of masculinity that was being advocated in this book. I thought the romance was nice. I liked Sebastian and Amir getting together. This was very much billed as an enemies to lovers romance, and I think that's somewhat true. It's mostly just that there's a real divide between Sebastian and Amir that they have to get over, and a lot of it is coming from Amir's perspective and his unwillingness to let other people in. So I would say it delivers on enemies to lovers as a romance. I do think that the narrative voice used in this book is a lot younger than I was expecting. This was written very simply, and the characters speak a lot younger than I was anticipating, especially considering they're all supposed to be about 17. So it just felt a little simple, but I did like the base plot and the sweetness of the romance, so I wound up giving this book 3 out of 5 stars. I'm very glad that my patrons chose this book for me to read in January, because it was fun. Next up, I want to talk about Renegades by Marissa Meyer. I can't believe that I put off reading this book, or that I thought I didn't want to read this book. I am such a pushover when it comes to superheroes. I will read any superhero book, and so, like, I loved this book. It's chunky, but the thing is, it's one of those real floppy paperbacks, so I don't want to read the second book until I can get it in a paperback, and it's gonna take ages for the third one to come out in paperback because the third one hasn't even been released yet. So this book is about a world in which people have super abilities. They are called prodigies, and there's a group called the Renegades, and they are a sort of heroes council that has gone from acting as vigilantes to now being in charge of running this entire community. They have become the system of government. And then there are the anarchists, who used to be led by Ace Anarchy, and they are very anti-renegade. And so this book is from two perspectives: Nova, who is a member of the anarchists, and a boy named Adrian, who is not only a member of the Renegades, but his dads are the, like, two most important people in the Heroes Council. This book was so great, and I want to talk about a specific part that made me like it, because I have read a lot of superhero narratives, so I want to mention the thing that stood out for me, and that is how creative the superpowers were. I think that if you're going to write superheroes, because we have a lot of them in our current culture. You've got to find a way to stand out and make that story interesting. And Adrian's abilities were handled so well in terms of, like, being incredibly original. So Adrian in the Renegade community, he's called Sketch. Basically, he can draw something and then make that thing come to life. He can draw and then just pull whatever he's drawn out of whatever surface he's drawn it on, and it becomes real. And so this is like an interesting idea on its own, but what's worked into that is that, like, if he gives himself a tattoo, he can use that tattoo to create an entire new superpower for himself, which I think is fascinating. I thought that it was really well handled. Adrian also has 2 dads. I loved them. They are great. Besides that, Nova is half Filipino and Adrian is described as having dark brown skin, so there's also that. I will say one of the things that went on with this book is that I think the world building every now and then could have used some clarification. Like, you get about halfway through this book and all of a sudden they start talking about how everybody got their powers. And up to that point, I just assumed that everyone was born with super abilities, but apparently that's only true part of the time. And I was kind of like, oh, we probably could have established this 200 pages ago, because now I'm very confused as to how super abilities work in this world. Those questions have still gone unanswered. So they're like world-building things that I wish had been handled better, but if you like superheroes, this is a fun book. It's got its moments of cheese, but that's what happens when you write about superheroes. I also think it's an interesting fleshed out world, and one of the only books I've ever read where you hear both sides of a story, and I understand both sides of motivation. I understand where Nova is coming from, and I understand where Adrian is coming from, and I think that that makes for a really complex story as you see how this world is built, and these 2 different opinions on maintaining that world. Plus, this ending knocked me on my ass. That's the other problem, is that I want to read Arch Enemies right away, but I want the paperback, but I want to know. It's very difficult. I wound up giving Renegades 4 out of 5 stars, and I cannot wait to read more books in this series, because it was great. And the last book that I read in January was In an Absent Dream by Seanan McGuire. This is actually the first book that I read in January, so that's odd. That's how that balances out. But this is the 4th book in the Wayward Children's series, and this book follows a character named Lundy, who we met in the first book, Every Heart a Doorway. Every Heart a Doorway, the series is set up so that every other book is a different kind of narrative. So Every Heart a Doorway is set at Eleanor West's Home for Wayward Children, which is a place that kids go who have gone through a door into a magical world, felt like they truly found their place, and then they are dumped back into our world and no longer feel like they belong here. Every other book in the series is set at Eleanor West's Home for Wayward Children, and then every other book besides those is an origin story. It is a what happens beyond the door story. So this is a door story. It is the story of Lundy and going to a goblin market inspired fantasy world. I adored absolutely every moment of this book. I'm gonna have to reread all of them to determine where this stands in terms of all of the rest of the books, but it's definitely one of my favorites. It might have surpassed Down Among the Sticks and Bones to be a second favorite, but I haven't read any of the books more than once, so it's gonna take a reread to determine. I loved the goblin market aspect of it. I actually studied the goblin market when I was getting my degree, so I really enjoyed that because I was like, ooh, I feel like I have some background knowledge. This is fun. Obviously, you don't need to know about the goblin market to read this, but it was cool having that background information. But yeah, Lundy goes to a world of high logic that is incredibly cruel, and this book broke my heart, just like every single other book in the series has broken my heart. So I highly recommend it. This was released at the beginning of January. I cannot wait to read the 5th book, which is going to be a book set back at Eleanor West's. I'm very excited to see characters who are still there and what is going to go on next. But I love these visits to worlds beyond doors. I think that they're written in this particular fairy tale style that just gets me in my heart. So I loved this book and I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars, just like I've given every other book in the series. Okay guys, that is it. Those are all of the books that I read in the month of January. Did you predict any of my ratings for these books back when I picked them in my January TBR? Let me know down in the comments below, and let me know if you have read any of these books and what you thought about them. Even if we disagree, I still want to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in another video very soon. Bye!